Landmarks, universities, cities, and towns across Canada face the prospect of being erased and renamed to unpronounceable Indigenous names because somehow these cities and towns uphold Canada's evil colonial history and therefore they must be destroyed. Anyone or anything that stands in the way of the destructive so-called truth and reconciliation movement, which has nothing at all to do with truth and very little to do with reconciliation, must be destroyed and must be targeted. And that is happening right now in a little town in British Columbia called Powell River. We are pleased to be joined now on the Faulkner Show by Dr. Francis Widdowson, formerly a tenured professor at Mount Royal University, who was fired after committing the ultimate sin in academia, daring to question the residential school narrative. Dr. Widdowson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
So you recently published an article in the C2C Journal titled "Collaboration No More: How the Powell River BC Name Change Debate Turned Nasty." A link to that article you can find in the description of this video. I want to just start off with this. Can you explain in more detail for our audience what is going on in the little town of Powell River, British Columbia? It's really an incredible story.
Yes, and I traveled there a couple of times, and I know quite a few people there. I participated in a number of events there myself, so I have an in-depth knowledge of what has been happening in that particular town. But it's not just Powell River, it's a whole bunch of other towns as well that are going through the same kinds of conflicts. And what happened in Powell River is that I believe it's May 2021, beginning of May, they had a meeting, and the local Indigenous group, the leaders of that group, which is the Tla'amin Nation, sort of floated the idea of a name change for the town. It was very tentative, but then in June 2021, this was after the Kamloops announcement, and Kamloops has its tentacles into all sorts of things that have been happening over the last 3.5 years. Anyway, the false claim that the remains of 215 children had been found was accepted as being true by all sorts of different people, including the Tla'amin Nation. This led them to write quite a demanding letter to the Powell River City Councillors saying that it wasn't a question of if the name would be changed, it was just a question of when. Then they embarked upon a long consultation process whereby it was supposed to be citizen-driven. That was sort of the pretense. But it had already been pretty much decided by this group of what's called woke counselors, which wokeism is identity politics that has become totalitarian. And their view was basically if a bunch of neo-tribal elites make a demand, everyone should just accept this under the guise of truth and reconciliation. The citizens of Powell River are very well educated and were very well mobilized. So they did a whole bunch of research and found out that a great deal of misinformation and perhaps disinformation was being spread about this. Pushed back, made all sorts of presentations to this working group, and it didn't matter, because although the citizens wanted a referendum to decide the question, the city councillors didn't want that to happen. And so they were basically just intent on pushing this through. So it's still a bit unclear what's going to happen in the end, whether they're just going to change it regardless or whether they have actually listened to what's going on. But right now, we're waiting for the municipal elections, which I believe are in 2026. And that's when it's been promised that they're going to have a referendum-like an initiative happen. But there's been some backtracking, so we're not quite sure what's exactly going to happen there.
And 2 gentlemen are now out of work because of this. Is that correct? One of them was fired from his job and another was pushed out or forced to resign?
So, yes, and this is one of the tragic kinds of consequences. And these are just the 2 that we know about. There's been a lot of fear in the town that if you speak out and put forward arguments opposed to the name change, you will suffer consequences. And there's 2 people that I found had this happen to them. Ted Vizzuti, who was a paramedic, and Brian Burrows, who was a custodial worker with the school board. Ted Vizzuti just, made some innocuous comments on his Facebook page, and he was pushed into early retirement. So, and then what happened is that usually what happens for paramedics is that they can work part-time after they retire, and they stopped him from being able to work part-time. So basically his career was over. And then Brian Burrows, who was actually thinking of retiring anyway, but when he just put a message on his Facebook page saying that he opposed the name change and he questioned the mass graves that had been announced, he was accused of being a racist by the superintendent of the school board. And there was disciplinary processes that were threatened, but until he retired, which he was planning anyway, but up until that point, he was ostracized by all of his colleagues, and he was just treated absolutely abominably by the school board, who basically, sort of accepted this view that he had said these racist things when he hadn't said anything that was just not, just kind of democratic action trying to say that he didn't want this name change to take place.
It's unbelievable. Now, you've faced the cancel culture mob over this issue, but I want to ask you, what are the broader implications of this push, this idea that, no discussion or debate can be had on this particular issue? What are the implications of this? Because I thought Canadians had the right to peacefully protest and speak their mind on certain issues. I must be wrong about that.
Yes, well, this is one of the problematic aspects of what's called truth and reconciliation, where truth does not mean truth and reconciliation does not mean reconciliation. And what it basically is this thing we call wokeism, which is this totalitarian identity politics, whereas to be compassionate, that's the argument, to be compassionate, you must affirm the identities of these indigenous neo-tribal elites. And this identity is the genocide survivor identity. So if you take issue with that claim, which it appears that there really is not very, convincing evidence that a genocide has taken place, starting with the Kamloops, the false Kamloops announcement, but all sorts of other things that have happened, then you will be tarred as a racist, and you will have your job threatened. That's what's happening. And the tragedy of it is that everyone recognizes that terrible injustices have been done to the Indigenous population. But these kinds of initiatives that are happening in the case of things like Powell River have nothing to do with assisting the marginalized members of Indigenous communities. It's all a bunch of privileged Indigenous leaders and the Aboriginal industry, which is a group of lawyers and consultants who make their living from siphoning money away from Indigenous communities to basically put forward grievances to extract more money for these various legal and bureaucratic initiatives.
So there is somehow a different definition of truth only when it involves this Indigenous issue. That's what it appears to be. Is that your read on this situation? That when it comes to this particular issue, when it comes to litigating the residential schools debate, there is somehow a different definition of truth that we only apply to that issue and not to any other issue in the country?
Well, there's a few issues where this is happening, which is sort of this postmodern relativist position, which has been unfolding in the university since the 1960s. But it is the most obvious in the case of the residential schools. And what it is, and this was actually stated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was, I believe it's Ronald Neetzen wrote a book called Truth and Indignation about this, that truth in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission means relative truth. So that is whatever an Indigenous person who's testifying believes to be true, that must be accepted in the objective sense of actually being a fact and evidence-based position. And the Kamloops case, nothing is better than this example. It is highly improbable that the remains of 215 children are buried in the Kamloops apple orchard, because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the residential school. So, who are the 215 bodies that would be buried there? And none of the people in the media or in academia or anything are asking the questions that need to be asked about this case. And it just continues. It doesn't matter what you seem to say and the evidence that you put forward to try to argue these cases. And Nina Green, who's the great intrepid researcher on this file, has been putting forward these arguments for 3.5 years, and people just ignore it and continue to pretend that there are these remains on that site when it is just highly improbable that that would be the case.
Well, Dr. Widdowson, the NDP want to criminalize what you have just said as residential school denialism. And I find it shocking that the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, the newest Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, said, I believe on CBC or CTV, it really doesn't matter which one, that he supports the legislation. He supports the idea of criminalizing residential school denialism, which is not denying that the residential school system exists, but it also includes what you've just said there. What do you make of this? This is dark times ahead for Canada if this actually gets into force.
This is definitely the case, and it is totalitarianism. This is the path that we are heading down. And the most disturbing thing is not silly people like Leah Gazan are putting forth these nonsensical ideas, but where is the outrage and the opposition to this sort of thing happening in a supposed democratic country like Canada? And again, it is this intimidation that is going on, that anyone who tries to make an argument that goes against the affirmation of the genocide survivor identity, which is a very implausible type of position. Now, people can make that argument, but you should be able to critique it, provide evidence which, shows this to be a bit exaggerated or whatever you do. And that's not to deny that there was terrible abuse that happened in a number of schools, that there were serious problems such as a lack of resources, the ventilation problems that were identified by Peter Bryce, the insensitivity that was shown to numerous residential school students, and on and on. But if you're going to make a claim that the remains of 215 children have been found, and then the whole arguments about genocide took off on that basis, shouldn't there be some kind of correction that is made whereby people recognize the extent to which the Canadian public was misled and $330 million was extracted on this basis? This is just an absolute outrage. And the Kamloops band, Tanya Talaga, who's a Globe and Mail columnist, Sean Carlton, the academic from University of Manitoba, are just completely shameless in their continuation of this false information, which continues to be perpetuated.
I want to go back to Powell River for a minute and discuss what we're seeing. It happens almost every time a Canadian historic figure is put under the microscope and put in the scopes of these radical woke activists. Let's look at the case with Powell River. Israel Powell, I believe, was his name. The idea was that Powell River was named after this guy who was I believe the Indian superintendent of British Columbia in the late 1800s. According to the local historian, which you quote in the C2C journal, it turns out that Powell is not accused, shockingly, of the posthumous crimes, or not guilty of the posthumous crimes he's been accused of committing. Just like John A. Macdonald appears to not be guilty of these crimes, and just like Egerton Ryerson. So does it really matter at this point? Does it really matter what figures in Canadian history actually did, or is it more of a fact of that they represented some Canadian history, colonial history, that means they must now be canceled?
And it's amazing. And there's a number of figures like this. Egerton Ryerson is the other
Yes.
individual who didn't really have anything to do with the residential schools and was much loved by many Indigenous people as someone who helped them. Powell was a man of his time, obviously, and so he might have done things which would be considered to be heavy-handed. But the evidence from Arthur Richards and Robin Tremblay, first of all, Robin Tremblay did extensive research and found that it's highly unlikely that Powell River is even named after Israel Powell. It was named after a person who also had the last name Powell, who was a cartographer. Arthur Richards showed that, Israel Powell didn't really have anything to do with the residential schools. He was interested in day schools and bringing public education to all citizens of British Columbia, including the people who lived in the Powell River area. And he was sort of one of the more benevolent of the administrators that existed and worked very hard to try to bring, the services that were required by Indigenous people. So the bottom line is that, the truth, people who are making these arguments don't care about the truth. They just want to impose their agenda and, basically intimidate anyone who opposes them. And the most bizarre thing, and this is now happening in Campbell River, is there's this insistence of spelling these names for the new place names in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Indigenous languages were pre-literate. They didn't have any writing system. Yet there's this attempt by to bring in this weird writing system that no one can pronounce,
Yes.
presumably to castigate everyone who isn't able to read this alphabet, which not even most Indigenous people can't read this either. So why is all this effort and money being spent on trying to bring in all these place names in a language a written language that no one can even pronounce? It's quite shocking when you look at everything that's happening.
It reminds me of the renaming of Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard in Ottawa in the National Capital Region. I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce the new name, but like you say, Canadians can't even pronounce these. It's absurd, really. It really is. I want to ask you this question, and I've asked other guests who I interview on this subject this exact question because I think it gets lost in this debate. What does any of this push to rename universities and towns and cities and erase and malign Canadian history, in your opinion, does any of that actually benefit Indigenous Canadians who are struggling at a disproportionate rate in our country and actually do need assistance and help?
It doesn't benefit them at all, and in fact, it ensures that the marginalization will continue. One, because it diverts funding. So, this $330 million that was spent to go and find missing children, which Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor, has admitted there are no missing children. These children are in cemeteries which used to be marked and no longer have the markers because they've deteriorated and people don't know where their great-grandmother is, which, is perhaps an issue, but that's not saying that children have been murdered. And we spent $330 million on that. That money should be spent on addressing the terrible social deprivation that exists in Indigenous communities. Secondly, in terms of reconciliation, which is supposedly why we're doing this, it just creates huge amounts of conflict between people, which is what we're seeing in, the Powell River case. And this is going to have negative implications for Indigenous people because instead of working together to try to address the terrible conditions, it's unfortunately going to be Indigenous people who are going to be blamed for the situation when it's not ordinary Indigenous people. It is these privileged neo-tribal elites and their lawyers that are making a killing off this, and the consultants like the members of the Powell River kinds of establishment that are the ones that have created this terrible situation. And we should just stop allowing ourselves to be intimidated by what is obviously destructive both for the truth and reconciliation.
And when it comes to your situation in particular, last month a tribunal found that your firing from the university, Mount Royal University, was disproportionate to your conduct, but they still said they're not going to bring you back. What's up
Yes.
with that? How does that exactly work?
Yes, well, that is being appealed now to the Alberta Labor Relations Board, so it's not over, and I will fight to the end to be reinstated at Mount Royal University. And the problem, once again, is the intrusion of this wokeism, totalitarian identity politics, into all of our institutions, including universities. And because some Indigenous scholar activists who participated in a mobbing to get me fired for my attempts to defend myself feel unsafe by me being returned to Mount Royal because they cannot tolerate their perspective being questioned, the arbitrator decided that the employment relationship was unviable and therefore I could not be returned, when I never did anything in the workplace at all. All my activities were just trying to satirize the attempts to get me fired. And the fact that I cannot be returned into the university to provide much, much needed critical perspectives on all these issues is an absolute travesty. And I will fight this to the end of my days, because this is absolutely absurd and unacceptable that I cannot be back at Mount Royal University doing what I love, which is engaging in my research and also providing students with a perspective that they are not getting at all in the current woke climate that exists at Mount Royal University.
Oh, we certainly need it, and I think a very large number of Canadians, hopefully it's the majority, think that this is a major story, and one that we hope to see you win. Once again, I want to direct the viewers to the article written in C2C magazine by Dr. Widdowson, "Collaboration No More: How the Powell River BC Name Change Debate Turned Nasty." You can find the link to that article in the description of this video. Dr. Widdowson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.